Hello, and welcome to Cry Havoc Wargaming, dedicated to bringing you the uncommon. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Ron, and today we're going to make a comparison of Pulp Alley's game, Pulp Alley, and Crooked Dice's game, 7TV Pulp. So let's get started. When I'm running games at conventions, particularly Pulp games, I'm often asked which of these two I prefer, Crooked Dice or Pulp Alley. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm not going to tell you that one of these games is better than the other. If that's what you come from, I'm afraid you're going to leave disappointed. Because I enjoy both of these games. It's one of the reasons I have them both, why I play them both. And I try to support both of the companies. So I'm a little awkward doing a review here. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to talk about some of the different mechanisms, the different things and features of these two games, and to show you how they differ, where they're the same, and leave it to you to decide which one meets your pulp genre needs best. The biggest difference right off the bat is probably money. Pulp Alley, it's a little less expensive to get started in. In fact, the basic rules, the starter set is available as a free PDF on their page. There are various cards used for the game, but those are all available for you to print yourself if you want. You could actually get started playing Pulp Alley for almost nothing. 7TV, on the other hand, is a little more expensive. Now, if you've got the money, don't let that frighten you away. This box set seems a little pricey. It's ticket price. The 3 separate rule books to instruct you on how to play the game. It comes with all the tokens that you need. It comes with dice. It comes with all the pulp cards. And by that I mean the character cards, the gadget cards, the MacGuffin cards, the cliffhanger cards, all the cards necessary to play the game, even some templates. So there's a lot that comes with the basic set. And if you go a little bit further and you buy one of their starter sets of figures, you can get started from there. So the initial investment may be a little more expensive with 7TV. And one of the reasons why Pulp Alley tends to be a little less expensive is it's simpler in its production values. I sort of alluded to that earlier. Originally, you had a choice of buying everything they made either in PDF or in hard copy form. This is the second edition hard copy book that I got with their Kickstarter recently. But even there, because of the PDF background, I suspect, and also partly because it fits the feel artistically that he's going for, it's a much simpler product inside. It's all black and white. The PDF versions, therefore, are easier for home printers. And I think a lot of that drove its history. So its production values are a little, the quality's still there, but the production values are a little less expensive. 7TV stuff is all multicolored pictures. It's all more in line with many typical modern games. So the quality of the materials can be a little more pricey. The cards are pretty much the same. I mentioned what you have to buy to get started with 7TV. What I didn't mention is their cards also are an option. You can buy their cards, but there's often PDF versions of cards available that can be printed out directly. So other ways of going. Both of the games are flexible. You can design them, though I would argue that's a little easier with Pulp Alley. Pulp Alley has a whole system in its rules for creating a character from scratch. In 7TV, they use a concept that they refer to as central casting, where you have a bunch of character archetypes. And so if you want a specific character to represent somebody you have in mind, there's a system within the book for how to change points. You basically pick a card that's close to your character and then make what alterations are necessary to make him a better representative of what you have. Both games rely on various systems of initiative. Pulp Alley is one of the more curious systems. In Pulp Alley, one of the players will be designated at the beginning of the game as being the director. And it falls to the director to determine which side on each activation will have initiative. So as the director, you can either decide to move one of your characters, or you can request that your opponent moves one of their characters. It's an option he has. Then after that character moves, again, unless the position of director changes, if you win a battle or you take a plot point, then you become director and the director's cone moves to you. But if that hasn't happened, then the director decides who takes the second action. And again, when I'm saying this, I mean the leagues, which side. A league is the term that Pulp Alley uses for their war bands. and he can do that each activation until every character on both sides has completed their activation, or like I said, if there's a change in who holds the directorship. 7TV, your characters, at the beginning of each turn you receive a certain number of what this game calls plot points. We'll discuss plot points a little bit more later because both games use them and they use them in entirely different ways. But in 7TV, a plot point is a currency you use to purchase your actions, your activations. And usually it's one plot point will allow the activation of a character, and then it gets 2 actions with its activations. Now, the reason I say usually is one of the points of 7TV is finding out how best to use these. You have to purchase the actions. If you run out of plot points, you can't keep purchasing and activating characters. However, many of the characters will have skills or abilities. Leader 3 comes to mind. Leader 3 gives a leader character the ability to activate 3 other characters if they're within a certain range of him, with an expense of an additional plot point. So he pays a plot point for his activation and another one to activate those other 3. And that's one of the ways that the thinking that you have to do and part of the strategy and tactics behind the game of 7TV. I should probably mention also that 7TV is an I go, you go game, where at the beginning of the game you roll to determine who has the initiative for the entire game. And it goes, I move all my figures that I can, all the activations I can afford, and you move all your activations, and vice versa throughout the game for a certain number of turns. Both of these games have counted turns. Usually a Pulp Alley game will be 6 turns. There's various things within the game that might cause the game to be expanded or reduced in length. Also, the scenario will tell you how many turns, so they're not always 6 turns. It can vary with scenarios. 7TV, they use what are called, well, in the Pulp game, they're called cliffhanger cards. One of the things that they've done with Pulp is change some of the terms to better fit the genre. In the original game, in 7TV, these were countdown cards. And that's because they are divided into 3 stacks. There is Scene 1, Scene 2, and Finale. And these cards will give a per turn event. As you go through the game, they get more and more impressive, more and more dramatic. To give you an example, a bungled stunt. Select 1 opposing extra. This model is knocked down. So a little advantage by knocking down one of your opponent's extras at the beginning of the game. But those cards are used to determine the length of a game of 7TV. You have a certain number of cards laid out based on your table size, and each player's turn, either 1 or 2 cards will be removed from that stack. Usually it's 1, but you can decide to burn 2 cards to make the game go by quicker if you just want the game to end faster, or more often than not, it's because you have some advantage. It behooves your side to see the game ended quicker. They act as event cards and as a timekeeping mechanism for the game. There are event cards in Pulp Alley as well. They work a little bit differently. They're referred to as fortune cards. You begin the game, every player, with a hand of 3 of these cards. And at the beginning of each turn, you take more cards. There's some exceptions. Some abilities that some of the characters have may allow them to have extra cards or to take multiple cards. These cards are worth a little discussion. A fortune card is used in a similar fashion to what we said earlier. This one I pulled, for instance, says, Eureka, play immediately. Place this card face up near the table until the end of the scenario. It has the effect that the winner of the scenario gains +1 gear point in addition to any other rewards. This card has a campaign value to it. It doesn't affect the actual game immediately, but the winner of this game will get a + gear point that he can carry over to use gear or gadgets in further games, later games. We'll talk a little bit about the campaign system in a moment. That's how it works as an event card. The card may have said something. It may have given you some benefit when you play it, or to cause your opponent some issue, some hazard when you play it. So you might just put it in your hand until that occasion arises. The other means that this card is used is to cause danger during the game. Usually certain areas in a Pulp Alley game will be designated as hazardous or dangerous areas. Maybe there's a pool of quicksand in the middle of the board. So whenever you enter into one of these hazardous areas, You then will pull a card and use the bottom section, which is called the challenge. This particular one, for instance, says 2 successes for might or finesse, in which case that character would have to roll 2 successful rolls using his might or finesse roll, or skills. That's, I mentioned earlier that there's a higher likelihood of using all of your various skills and attributes within Pulp Alley than there is in 7TV, and that's one of the reasons why. The other reason, these are also used when you take your objectives. Both games have objectives that you're attempting to take. In 7TV, these objectives are just marked with little counters. There's 5 of them usually, and they're all generic. You don't know what they are. You can create a narrative purpose or reason behind them, but it's not necessary. One of those is usually, this is an optional role, but often one of those will be treated as a MacGuffin card. And again, even in the Spy 5 version, they stated that a MacGuffin should be given a role. It should be designated what it represents. A lot of players didn't bother with that, and they've sort of made it easier now. One of the improvements with Pulp is they now have what are called MacGuffin cards. You can pull a card that will describe what that item is, and it'll now give an advantage to the side that has it, besides just in victory points to the end of the game. In a similar fashion, Pulp Alley also will have objectives, but theirs are called plot points. I mentioned that term was used by both games. Plot points can be items, they can be people. They will, if you're using a pre-written scenario, they will be designated by the scenario what they all are. If you're creating a scenario of your own, you can designate them. There's even a chart in the book for rolling up random designations for what these plot points might be. So they all represent individual things. Now, whenever you take a plot point in 7TV, it's just a special action. It takes one of your activations, you pick it up, you get some plot points. So it actually gives you further activations by giving you plot points you can use again later. In Pulp Alley, all plot points are considered a hazardous area. You have to play a challenge and risk taking damage just to approach that plot point. When you get within 6 inches of it, then you have to play a challenge to play the plot point. You have to do what is on one of these cards to actually take the plot point. Once you've done that, though, you will pull a reward card. The reward card tells you what you get for doing this, besides victory points to the end of the scenario. This particular one, for instance, says, while holding this plot point, as an action for this character, you may discard 1 fortune card to force all other players to discard 1 random fortune card. So it has an in-game use. And on the bottom, it usually will have a campaign game use. This one saying, holding this card at the end of the game gives your league a +1 to their experience. So carries over from one game to the next. What I'd like to do right now is show you some of the difference between the cards for the various characters involved in the game. This card on the left is a 7TV Pulp card, and this card on the right is a Pulp Alley card. The main difference between these two games comes from the feel of the metagaming concepts of the game. The concept in Pulp Alley is that you are actually in the period. You are in the 30s or 40s or whatever period you may want to be playing Pulp Alley in. And in theory, the reality of the game is real for the characters. In 7TV plays with that it is in fact a movie. And we'll talk a little bit more how that affects the game. But what it means is that their character cards, the basic cards that come with the set, are basically what is called central casting. So this card on top of it here says Big Game Hunter, instead of having a man's name on it. Pulp Alley, the stats are all recorded in a number of dice. For instance, the character I have in front of me here has 3d8 in his brawl skill. And what that tells me is that when he wants to use brawl, he rolls 3d8. His opponent is either going to roll their brawl or they're going to dodge. And that's always an option. If he was shooting, they'd have the option to return fire. You can keep doing that each turn. So you don't only fire on your own turn. Now each time you're involved in a brawl or a shoot action in Pulp Alley, it does count as a multiple combat. And most characters will suffer a reduction to their dice in future combats for each combat they've been in. So you can only keep doing this so long. Dodge doesn't have that disadvantage. In that case, he'd roll his 3d8. If he was fighting somebody with a brawl, say of 2d6, they'd roll. He could then take any of his victories, anything he rolls that's a successful hit, he can take those and remove his opponent's hits if they're equal to or higher. So he can either take all of his hits, if he rolled, say, all 3 successes, and his opponent was rolling, what did I say, 2d6, and only rolled 2 successes. If the numbers were right, he could stop his opponent's attacks on him. It would stop 2 of his, but so Cutter here would do 1 to his opponent would do none. But that's his option as the attacker. If it was a dodge roll, the decision to do that blocking would fall to the dodgier. 7TV uses a d6 dice system. Again, you want to roll for successes. The way you're going to roll in this game, you say you're shooting, you pick your target. Your target rolls his defense. He rolls defense before anything else. One of the mechanics of this game is those plot points I mentioned earlier in this game. You use those to activate characters, but you can also use them to increase your defense or your shooting skills. So what you can do is you can spend a plot point to get extra dice. So with your defense, you're always going to get 1 free d6 roll. If you spent, say, 2 plot points, you get 2 extra dice. So now you're rolling 3 d6. When you roll those, you're going to count the highest die, whatever the highest result is. You're going to add that to your skill in your defense, your dodge, basically. Let's say it's 6, and you rolled a 4, you now have 10. And then those 2 other dice, instead of just adding the number like you might have expected, if they're 4, 5s, or 6s, they count as a +1 to the die roll. There's also certain modifiers. Most of the modifiers stop your ability to add dice to your rolls, but give you an automatic +1. So at the end, that total would give you the defense roll. That's what the target has rolled. The shooter now has to overcome that. He has to equal or pass that number by doing the same thing. He rolls whatever his fight skill is with the weapon being used. He rolls a d6, he adds that to it. There's modifiers for that as well. Or he can, like I mentioned, he can do the same thing. He can improve his attack by spending a plot point to add dice to it. And they add the same way. So the highest die gets added to his attack score, with any 4, 5, or 6 counting as an additional +1. Gadgets are available in both games, as they should be in a Pulp game. In Pulp Alley, they're purchased. You either buy them as part of the design of your character, but there's also gear and gadgets you can acquire by campaign rolls in the game. I mentioned earlier that card that said +1 gear is a great example. In 7TV, they give you gadget points. You get a gadget pool to that. You take whatever that total gadget pool is, and you pull twice that number in these gadget cards. But you have the ability to then select down to half of those for the gadgets you're actually carrying during the game. In 7TV, most of the gadgets are one-time use only. Sometimes they take a plot point to use them. I should mention that also some of the abilities in 7TV also take plot points to use that ability, whereas your abilities in Pulp Alley are just part of your character and come with the game. I suppose what we should talk about here now is the differences between the games. I've talked about mechanical differences and details like that. But why would you play one game over the other? What's the advantage or disadvantage? I would argue that Pulp Alley is the more flexible of the 2 games. Because you create a character from the scratch, from the beginning, because of the nature of the attributes and how they're written, it is very easy to change this to be anything you want. When I use it, I typically use it for what you'd expect for pulp games set in the 30s or 40s. But I've used it to run Wild West games. I've seen it used to do science fiction. There's a few people who are running a campaign based in Firefly's world, all using this game. A friend of mine in England says he plays all his historic skirmish games using these rules. That's how varied and how flexible they are. One of the reasons they are so flexible is they have a complete system of rules, as I mentioned, for creating your character from scratch. And there's modifiers and ways of changing some of the details and removing some aspects of the game, the more fantasy aspects, for instance, if you were playing a historic game, and things such as that. 7TV's biggest difference is that their game, it's not supposed to be real. It's supposed to represent either, well, in this case, movies mostly. Movies. This particular one is set to be pulp. those pulp films of the 30s and 40s, or some of the modern remakes like Indiana Jones. But this is a little bit more specific to the time and frame. And that is typical of how 7TV does things. And that's one of the areas where they're a little less flexible. The rule system is very flexible, but they've taken a different means where they divide it into various genres. So the first of those, or the first of the second edition, was Spy-Fi. Then they came out with Apocalypse, and Apocalypse takes the same basic rule system and puts it into post-apocalyptic genres, whether that be post-nuclear or zombies, Mad Max, whatever you have. And then this one is Pulp. They're working right now on a fantasy one. Each of these box sets, because of these changes, have little tweaks that make them different than the others, that better fit the genre, but the biggest difference is going to be in that central casting. There aren't just universal characters for everything in any of these boxes. They're geared more around the individual genres they come in, and that limits it a little more. You can still step beyond that and figure out how to stretch it into other genres if you wish. They haven't given you the rules for doing that. Instead, they sell separate packages. And of course, I mentioned earlier that the concept of that metagame, it's a little more tongue-in-cheek. Your event cards might be something like continuity or error, and a character is relocated somewhere else, or a piece of terrain that was there is not there. Things that happen in badly made B movies, but don't happen in the real world. But that's part of what gives it its feel. Some people will probably hate that in the game. I really enjoy it. It's one of the things I like about 7TV, but that's something to keep in mind is going to be an aspect of that game. I mentioned the escalating cliffhanger cards or countdown cards. In Spy-Fi, I once had a game change who was winning ended up losing, all because of the power of one of those finale cards. So again, it can be a little more random. Some people hate that. I enjoy it, and that's one of the things that will cause me to use that game if I'm going to that particular game. Pulp Alley, as I mentioned, Pulp Alley is very, very flexible. It's a little cheaper. It can do just about anything. I think those are really what you want to look at. Which gives you more of the feel that you want, or you can try them both. I've got two sample games, both up here on display, both taking place with the same characters, with basically the same character concepts between both sides, and on the exact same tabletop, to give you an idea in play on how those games can vary. Either of them will give you hours of pleasure and are perfectly enjoyable. So whichever one you choose, I think you'll have a good time and have a lot of fun. If you play either of these games, or perhaps one of the other games in this genre, go ahead and tell us down in the comments below. Tell us what you like about these games or the game that you prefer. If you've enjoyed this video, go ahead and push like or subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you next time here on Havoc Wargaming. Cheers.